Thanks everybody for joining us on another episode. And for those of you who are regular listeners at this point, since this will be episode 3, Elliott is still on the house search, even though in recording time, a few weeks have gone by. So, Elliott, why don't you tell us a little bit about I mean, first off, you just sound frustrated, which I think anyone at this point would be, but you've actually been texting me saying, Matt, talk me out of this. And it's a fun question, I think, just in the work with our clients, because there's like this preloaded like thing out there on the internet now where in order to be wealthy, one must own a house, or the common phrase of, well, if I'm renting, I'm just throwing money or burning money every month. And well, I've certainly had that sentiment myself when I was renting, and especially here in Madison, like the crappy college house that, 5 of us shared, and paying $3,000 a month for that total was like, what are we paying for exactly? I get it, but I also don't think it's true. And I think it relates a lot to just having more pressure on that decision and causing poor financial decisions, but also it might lock some people into situations they don't want to be, especially later on in life in terms of owning a house that may need repairs. So why don't we'll set the stage there, but I want to hear, where you're at in the process and what numbers you're thinking about as you maybe end up as a renter,
Yeah.
if you can't find a house.
Yeah. So I also really dislike that phrase that renting is throwing money away. I am renting right now and it's been fabulous. I don't have to deal with maintenance. I know exactly what I'm going to pay every month. There are no surprises. If something breaks, I just put in a maintenance request. And honestly, I try to time those because usually they show up, I want to say almost instantly. So I have to be careful so that I'm not having a bunch of meetings that day. So renting's been great in that. I don't think it's throwing away. There's a peace of mind that that's the upper end of what you're going to spend. And I can leave at any time, right? Once my lease is up, it's very easy to exit that and find a different living situation. Go for it.
No, keep going.
I was just going to say mine, getting to the financial aspect of this, wanting a house is purely a lifestyle decision at this point. Financially, I'm pretty confident it's not going to work out in my favor, like versus renting. I think it will be more expensive. And that's why I say it's a lifestyle decision, that this is something that I want as we get a dog. We want more space, and just not, again, not hearing the neighbors upstairs with their music pounding like I heard last night, that sort of thing. So for me, it's more of a lifestyle decision than a financial one in this situation.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's really important, right? And like you said, in your renting situation now, like part of the lifestyle could be just being able to go do things and not have to worry about, well, I mean, for most houses, right? Like, I need to mow the grass, I need to do this, I need to do that. But it also has impacted some of your other lifestyle choices of like wanting a dog, right? Like, so that's a negative on the renting side, and just not having the space for that. So I think it's a really good place to start, because I think it's not only the cost, but also the time and energy that you might end up spending on taking care of the house is a luxury that most renters don't have to worry about, right?
Definitely. And that will be adjustment. I've never had a yard in my adult life. I own a townhome in Seattle, and it's got a little strip of land that we've done some gardening, but that's nothing more than a few hours every year, probably.
Yeah. And so you want to do it for the first time here in the Midwest where you're going to have to deal with snow. You just want the full experience, right? So,
Exactly. And we've been looking at lots of corner lots for whatever reason. So that way we get more sidewalk to shovel. It's great.
well, blessing in disguise maybe for not getting those. But anyways, moving back to it too, I hear a lot of this, and I know you work more with retirees than I do, but I hear a lot of concerns as well for those either thinking about retiring, or now they've entered retirement and maybe their current house isn't quite serving them in the way it used to. Maybe there is more work, or maybe it's just too big to keep up with everything. What would you say to the people out there who feel this pressure to either have their mortgage paid off before they go into retirement, or that they can't move into either a nicer house or a different house and have a mortgage in retirement?
Yeah, there's lots of thoughts, and I don't know if I have it narrowed down completely here, but I think for a lot of people who refinance the last few years who have a super ultra low rate, obviously having a mortgage paid off is a nice sort of emotional freeing. And that, again, we can sort of talk about the emotional side of finance or the financial side of finance. So emotionally, that's nice to have it paid off. But from an interest rate perspective, I mean, inflation's almost eroding that entire value, right? If you have a 3% mortgage rate and inflation's higher than 3% and you're earning, say, 4% on your savings account, it's tough to stomach, at least for me personally, paying that off. For some people, it's just the freedom and the peace of mind to have it paid off, which is a great thing. But you don't need a paid off mortgage in retirement, assuming you have the income and the assets to support that. It's not a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of the quintessential question that we get, at the start. Like how much money do I need to retire? And there's so many factors that go into it, but having a mortgage could be a big one of those, right? Like
Yeah.
what you're spending now may actually decrease in the third, fourth, fifth year of retirement if you are really close to having that mortgage, which means you may need less than most calculators are going to tell you.
Yeah.
Just because most calculators are going to say, well, how much do you spend? And here's how much you need to take from that portfolio every year. And here's your social security. But if those dynamic expenses change, the number could actually be a lot lower, which means either you can save less now and enjoy your life ahead of retirement a little bit more, or maybe retire a little bit earlier if that's what you want to do. So
Yeah.
I
I've
love that.
also run into some stuff, Matt, where some people want to travel in early retirement and a house, although you can, it gets more complicated of do you have a family member stay there? Do you have a house sitter? Do you make it into a rental and risk someone coming into your space? Do you furnish it or not? So there are a lot of decisions that go into that. Whereas if you are renting, and I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I've noticed that people who are renting in early part of retirement, they just let their lease go and then they go travel for as long as they want and don't have essentially double rent or trying to figure out how to manage the house.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point too. And it is just that flexibility piece, right? And not having to worry about, oh, we got a pretty severe storm here a few nights ago in Madison. Like, don't have to worry about, is the roof okay? Did the basement flood? All those things. So, yeah, there's definitely some peace of mind there in that aspect too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I want to go back because I know you mentioned interest rates. In trying to debunk or maybe reframe the concept of rent being burning or throwing money away. But when we think about these historically high, at least for most people, in today's day and age, with historically high rates, you're still not just banking all of those monthly payments into this house, right? So I guess can you share a little bit with the listeners why you're not essentially saving all of that money that you're otherwise burning when it comes to rent?
Yeah, I'll use myself as an example, and it's going to depend on how long you've had your mortgage and that sort of thing. But assuming I start fresh, I've talked about how the plan for this house is 3 years. And let's say we take out, I don't know, $400,000 mortgage, just as an example. The the principal that you'd pay down over 3 years, given the rates approximately where they are today, you're paying down about $13,000 worth of principal over those 3 years. So, your payment might be up there, much higher than the 13,000 over 36 months. But you're not really paying that down because mortgages interest is front loaded. So if you look at an amortization table, and I wish I had one up, you could basically see most of your payments at the beginning are going solely to interest and very, very little principal is getting paid. Whereas, maybe you've had the mortgage for a long time. It's mostly principal on the back end. So more of that is getting paid off.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to try and predict the future, but it's extra dangerous in this current housing market that we find ourselves in, just with the rapid appreciation of homes, right? So you are getting some like extra equity just through the appreciation of that house, right? But if the market were to flatline or maybe not increase at the rate it is, right? Like Elliot said, most of those first half of your mortgage, honestly, like, right? If the first half of that mortgage, you're going to be making a lot more payments towards interest, which is really no different than paying your landlord, right? It's just now your landlord is the bank, and it's on a lot bigger balance than your monthly spend on a rental for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything you'd want to add to that? I know you have some fun charts to to show here today. So
Yeah, I mean, why don't we jump into it? I really like the New York Times back in 2014 put together a rent versus buy calculator, and I really like this because it removes the whole common sentiment of rent's throwing money away or you have to buy a house, and actually looks at just the financial piece. Again, we're going to ignore the lifestyle piece of this for a second, but just looking at, okay, if I bought a house today and it's X dollars, what happens? So I want to share my screen. This might take me a moment, but I want to
yeah.
show for those who are on video here.
And while Elliott's pulling this up, I just want to make the disclaimer that, please, if you're in the process of thinking about buying a house, like talk to either your realtor, or you can look up some of these things. Like I know here in Madison, you can just look up what the average utility bills are for a specific address. You can see property tax increases. You could probably, like we said in the other episodes, reach out to an insurance agent and actually see what some of these costs are going to be, because I'm sure Elliott will tell you in the search, property taxes here in Dane County, Wisconsin, are a little different than Seattle. So
it's definitely different. And I think the other thing that's caught me off guard is someone who owned their house 10 years, that assessed value is nowhere close to what it's going to sell for. So just that getting reassessed by the time you purchase it, there's going to be a big difference between what someone else is paying for property taxes and what we will end up, or whoever's purchasing the house will end up paying.
yeah, and you can go back to episode 2 to listen about that. So
Great. So let's jump into this and let's just go with $500,000 for the home price that we plug in here. You can plug in any value that you want into this New York Times calculator. And here's where we get to play with some of the inputs. Matt and I went through and just put in some random figures for it, but let's go through them. How long do you plan to stay put? So oftentimes it's harder to break even or do better on a home purchase if you're going to stay fewer years. So we plug 9 into this calculator just
yeah.
for the heck of it.
Yeah, and for the audience, Elliott, why don't you, because you're only planning on staying for 3 years, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to do some counseling with Elliott here today. We're gonna try and talk him off of the ledge. So let's drop that back to 3 years there, Elliott.
Let's drop it to 3. Okay.
And so for those of you watching, and I'll just kind of highlight it for those of you listening, but now Elliott's break-even price for renting versus buying went from $2,400 to about $3,400. So that means he could actually rent for $3,500 a month, which is a pretty darn nice apartment here in Madison, and maybe be better off than buying.
Yeah, and it's a big maybe. When we start plugging into the details, let's say we get, I don't know, I have this at 7.125 or so of a mortgage rate. That's sort of where things were as of us recording this call. If we put 20% down, the mortgage is 30 years. And then we can start to make some best guesstimates on home price growth rate, rent growth rate, investment return. So we did 4% on home price growth rate, 4% on rent, 6% investment rate of return, 3% inflation. And then we plugged in property taxes. They're about 1.6% here. What the effective marginal tax rate that you'd be in.
Yeah. Elliott, can we go before we go there, can we go back to those assumptions, and why is it important, when you're going through this and maybe using this tool yourself, why is it important to look up long-term averages when it comes to some of these assumptions?
That's a great question. So I don't want to take necessarily the last 3 years of home appreciation rates and project that into the future indefinitely, because I think that's unreasonable personally. I don't know what it means for the economy if home prices appreciate at 20% per year indefinitely.
Well, I'll be able to retire. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, yeah, I just want to point that out because it is very, very easy to get caught up in either some of the advertising that I know, I'm sure we'll have a rant about this someday, that I'm very publicly critical about. Some realtors advertising 20% year over year returns and helping people make a decision based on those numbers. Let's not forget about 2007, 2008. Like, I'm also not sitting here calling the next housing crisis, but we have to understand that what's true today or a couple of years ago isn't necessarily going to be what you want to bank on for the next, in your case, 3 years, right?
Yeah. And that's a good call out, because I want the long-term averages. I don't know what short-term means. I mean, we could certainly say, okay, what happens? I don't even know if the calculator will let you go to 20%. It won't. It caps out at 15% and the results get really wonky. I never tried this, so I wanted to try this while we were talking, but let's set this back. So that was a good call out there, Matt. And then looking at taxes and closing costs, that's another big thing. If you're purchasing a home, just paying attention to closing costs. And I know there was a settlement recently, and we're not going to go into that and what that could potentially mean. But let's assume 4% for cost of buying a home versus 6% for selling. You want to factor that in because there's some opportunity costs with that. And then also maintenance. And I think we talked about this last time, Matt, that
Mhm.
I think it's really important to plan on maintenance on a home. When we talk about renting, that's the most you're going to pay. Mortgage is the minimum you're going to pay.
Yeah, and two, again, since we're working with averages here, if you want to go back to that episode where we talk about some of the unexpected costs of owning a house, the short term could actually be, I mean, it could be better, right? But it could be a lot worse, like something we're dealing with right now with having to replace the roof. So it's just go back and listen to the episode. But again, we just want to highlight these are averages.
Yeah. So plug in all of this. There's some other smaller details here, but basically what this is saying, if we do 3 years, buy a $500,000 house, if I could rent, or anybody in this situation can rent a home for less than roughly 3,500 bucks, then renting would be better given all these inputs. Now, none of all of these inputs are going to come out to be correct, but it's sort of a way to look at this financially.
Yeah, yeah, and so yeah, for those of you watching, Elliot, could you go turn that to like a 30-year situation for how long you plan to
Oh
stay?
yeah.
Because I just want to highlight that as you go further along this curve, right, or the time is passing by where when you get that mortgage, right, assuming you're getting a fixed rate, you're essentially locking in, other than property taxes and insurance and repairs, you're locking in or hedging against rent prices going up, right? Whereas on that month or year to year lease, you don't have that luxury. And if your landlord comes back to you and says, hey, rent's going up 10, 15%, like it has in the past couple of years, like again, those are some of those short term scenarios that can change the numbers a lot. But really, when you think about what luxury you're buying with buying a house, it's you have a place to make your own, and you're attempting to lock in as much of your housing costs as you can for a very long period of time.
Yeah. And just to bring this back from a personal decision, if we look at 30 years, like Matt had talked about, it goes to 2,100 bucks a month. It'd be really hard to find a home that rents for 2,100 bucks here, at least in Madison in this scenario. Whereas if I go back to 3 years, you could probably find a pretty nice house in most circumstances for 3,500 bucks or less per month. So
Yeah,
then
and
it
especially
comes to how much is the peace of mind to have your own place and potentially pay more, and the risks and pros and cons of that.
and especially when we think about your scenario, right? And so just to give some context into what we've already alluded to slightly, like Elliot would need an extra room to run his business out of because he works from home. He wants space for a dog, like he wants a yard and place for the dog to go. So like those things would be, I think even at $3,500 a month, that would be pretty tough to find. Like all those with the commute that you want for your wife. So
Yes.
Molly, we know you're going to listen, so we just wanted to acknowledge that too. But yeah, as Elliot drops that curve out to the 30-year mark, and now we're looking at 2,100. I would say it's going to become next to impossible to find all of those things that check that box. And that's where you're in that tough spot, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
what else would you want to share, or just like point out to those watching or listening on this topic?
I think I just want to reiterate that renting is not wasting money. There's a lot of flexibility that comes with it. And then maybe just again, hammering the point that separating the financial versus the lifestyle choice, right? Regardless of how these finances worked out, if I had the ability to pay more, even though renting might be cheaper, I might just want to own the house and the peace of mind that comes with that. If that's a peace of mind thing for me. For other people, it might be the exact opposite. So I think running the financial analysis and then looking at the lifestyle decisions are super important.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And I think the last thing I'll add to that before we wrap up is, when you think about that for the long term, or maybe after you enter retirement, right? A retirement number is very much predicated upon how much you're going to spend, like for a long period of time. And whatever you want that basket of spending to be, right? Maybe you want more of that allocated to your housing to enjoy that because you can't or don't want to travel. Like, believe it or not everyone wants to retire and be a globetrotter. That's not necessarily what they want to do. So make sure you're asking, like, what kind of lifestyle do I want? How do those lifestyle choices impact what you're going to spend on a monthly basis? And if you already have a plan to know what you need to spend to make it all work, I think you're going to feel pretty confident making whatever decision it is you feel you need to make.
Yeah. Hey, Matt, I thought of one more thing actually, now
Yeah.
that we've said we're wrapping up.
Yeah.
So I think it's important, we've talked at different stages here. I'm talking about myself being younger. We've talked a little bit about retirement. We didn't talk about sort of the near the more the end of life or older, say
Mm.
70s or 80s. And I think that's something just worth mentioning that I see a lot of folks decide to either buy into a condo for less maintenance and or rent somewhere. There's actually someone in my building who wants this apartment when we leave. This older lady who first time living in an apartment, and I think it's one of those situations where it was, I don't want to deal with the maintenance or anything else like that. So I think that's just important to keep in mind that different stages of life may dictate renting versus buying. And it's pretty normal when you get older that you may not want the responsibilities of dealing with the house.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another, pro in that box, right? Or a pro check in that box is, especially when you're thinking about those end of life, like maybe you can downsize or find something that has, like Elliot saying, some more creature comforts, shall we call them that will allow you to not go to a nursing home.
Yeah.
Like, and nursing homes pretty darn expensive. So I think you could have one of the nicest apartments in Madison with probably some in-home help for less than the cost of the average, nursing nursing facility room. So those are just some things to think about too. But I think the big takeaway is, like, don't put too much pressure on buying a house. Like, it's going to make or break you. Don't put too much pressure on having a mortgage. Feel like it's going to make or break you, because the truth is, your situation is probably different than whoever's giving you that advice, and you should proceed accordingly to what you want to do and make sure it's all going to be okay in your world.
Well said, Matt.
All right. Awesome. Well, it was fun to chat, Elliot. I'm sure we'll have some more good questions and topics as we go along. So, chat next time.
Sounds good. Enjoy.